Welcome to the Phoenix Effect podcast with Elle, Kristin, and Dennis. We are three narrative-trained therapists, and we will be interviewing storytellers from all walks of life. We will explore what people do to find belonging, purpose, and success. Listen in as we delve into the depths of the human experience. If you have a story you would like to tell, stay tuned to find out how to become a part of the show. Are you ready for a good story? Here we go. Hey listeners, Elle here. A few weeks ago, we sat down and we recorded a podcast with a guest. She was a very interesting person. She had amazing stories, but the story engagement itself wasn't exactly something that we wanted to publish. What you're about to listen to is Kristin, Dennis, and I processing that. What was going on for the three of us at the time? Dennis, do you want to go first with what your first reaction was when we said goodbye?
It was like lightly frustrated because I would think I was so hopeful for this one because actually this felt like one of the first times we actually got a story that had some ground level material to it. And I think I was hoping for ground level engagement and then just disappointed and less hopeful at the lack of engagement that happened.
Yeah. It sounds like you read what she wrote, and so it seemed if she's able to write this way, she'll be able to engage in a certain way.
Yeah, that was probably the meaning I made out of it, that this would be a guest that would be more capable of engaging in the way that we were hoping to with people through our Elle training. And in a way that we want our guests to see what type of healing is possible through the story work.
Yeah, when we clicked off, I noticed you turned on yourself a little bit.
What'd you do, Dennis?
What'd I do?
You don't remember?
You have it on video?
I don't have that part on video. Yeah, it sounded like you turned to shame a little bit, like it's because of your lack of skill, of you didn't know how to engage her, and that was the problem. That just seemed to pop up for you pretty quickly.
It's interesting. Yeah, I can't recall. I did have the sense that I was talking more than I wanted to maybe. And I did have the sense that, okay, like this intro did not go like I had hoped it would, even from the beginning. So I could see where I don't feel that right now. I don't feel like I do, however, always hold that there is I don't know. I remember like when I was doing soccer, I think it was my 8th grade year. I went to the soccer camp like in Chicago. So it was like a ways away. And the dude was talking about that actually no goal is unsavable. There's no unsavable goal. And I do know that like when you're surrounded by these goalies and people are recounting the stories, and if they got scored on and different things, there would be the term, that one was like unsavable. There's nothing that could be done. And then this guy was questioning that mindset of that's not true. If you're there, there's always a way. And so I think I keep that mindset. So I do think what would have been the way for her? 'Cause I do think like there is a way. There is a way that had I done it slightly different, it might have been held differently. It might have had a different outcome. And that could be maybe challenged because we do know like it takes the other person, like I can't control what they're doing, but I can't help but think had I chosen some other route, it might have been a better engagement.
And what did you make of when Kristin asked a question and she completely didn't answer the question?
I actually am wondering if one of us should have said something, should have even pointed that out to her, if that might have been the route to get her into more. I don't know. That I'm always on the balancing wire of wanting to be kind. And I wonder what her response might have been had we even pointed that out to her.
We did. I know Elle did.
I'll be honest with you. I don't think there's anything you guys could have done differently. I think you guys are brilliant and amazing.
But you could have done something different?
I noticed that when Elle asked the question about Kristin. I'm like, of course, Kristin could have done. There's nothing.
Gotcha. Right?
She's great. Like,
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess that's why I thought maybe we should process, because it seemed like we all had a pretty storied reaction to what was happening. And I wasn't sure if it was because her protective parts were very present. I think a lot was happening for all of us as we tried. How did that feel for you, Kristin?
Yeah, I want to hear what was happening for y'all, but I can say from my perspective, it's interesting because this is something that I have been working on outside of this podcast and it ties into what we were talking about before with power dynamics, because like the podcast is therapy and we are not this person's therapist. But when I am someone's therapist and I am doing therapy and they're having a similar type of presentation of just a lot of talking, it's like kind of this convergence of like how I've been socialized as a woman and as a woman that grew up in the church of don't ever interrupt because your opinion is not important. And if you try to interrupt, if you like the act of interrupting is saying that what you have to say is more important than the person who's already speaking. And if you take that into the conversation about with power dynamics, it's as a therapist or as a person who is a listener, I don't want to ever think that what I have to say is more important than the person who is sharing or the person in some cases paying me to listen to them. And so I feel this weird, I don't want to overpower. I don't want to manipulate somebody. I don't want to, like, it's a real wrestle within me, but be like to say that I know that you're talking, but I think what I have to say is more important. So I'm going to interrupt what you're saying in order to like interject. And it's something that I've brought to my supervisor and kind of talking about how do I do this? And she has talked about like how some people don't know how to have a conversation, and not in a bad way, but that's part of the role as their therapist is to be like, this is how we're going to set the frame for being in this space. We need to have some back and forth because they're just showing up and like, we don't know what to do. And especially if the defensive parts are showing up, like it's really, as soon as you start pushing up against defensive parts, they're just going to push back even stronger, right? So it is a skill to be able to know how to work with the defensive parts instead of against them. And I think that's still a skill that I'm learning, but it was really, I think, powerful for me to see you guys just interrupting, because I was sitting there the whole time kind of being like, okay, Kristin, interrupt, do it. I couldn't do it. I took one opportunity, but that wasn't even mine. Like, Elle, you handed it to me because you saw that I was about to say something and then I stopped myself.
hey, can I ask you? So, Kristin, that was so powerful what you were describing before, the feeling that it is there with the interruption. How young of a feeling is that?
Oh, this is like my whole life, right? Like if you're a woman, if you're a child first, and then if you're a woman, your opinion doesn't matter. That is not important. If someone else is speaking, you always have to let them speak.
What would happen if you interrupted your mom?
I think that message came a lot more from my dad, interrupt. And I think just societally, like, I don't know if it was ever, I don't know what the explicit messaging was. But I do know, like, times that I really had something that I wanted to say, I was often put in my place, right? Or I soon regretted making the choice to say what I actually thought.
And when you read anger on her face, as Dennis and I kept interrupting, what was happening for you?
Yeah, I could see, I think one time Dennis interrupted and I saw this kind of exasperated, right? Of you just won't let me finish. And I was like, oh, it feels really uncomfortable. It felt so uncomfortable. And especially because at the beginning, she said, she like complimented us in a way of, oh, she set the stage.
She actually told us not to go after her parents, was my takeaway from that. That compliment was less of a compliment and more of a threat or nicety of us not going after any of her mom or dad over herself. Yeah.
She complimented us on our kindness with how we treat our listeners.
Mm. And so
Yes.
that was so present in my mind of, oh, we have to give her that experience. And I knew the dynamic and what was happening, and I still couldn't get out of what I felt the expectation from me was.
Mm.
Yeah. And so that was my frustration of like my own place in that dynamic and being able to see it, but not knowing what to do to get out of it. I wish that I had, and Dennis, you both said some brilliant stuff, which she may or may not have been able to hear or receive, but I think it was probably more helpful than me just sitting there and listening to her.
You mentioned two things. Like when you were talking about that feeling, you said part of it was the idea that you might have something more important to say than what they do. Do I have that right? Is that a belief you hold?
Yeah, I'm just like, what do I know? I'm believing you for what you're giving me. So you're telling me that you don't want to go there. So I'm not going to make you go there. Like, I'm not going to. It's a really passive response.
Direction that you want to go in this session. And who am I to interrupt you?
Yeah. My supervisor challenged me of sometimes you do know more. That's okay. And I think as a therapist, that is my job, right? Like when I'm sitting with clients and feeling the same type of thing, but it's really hard for me to think that
Yeah.
or believe that.
They're coming to you for your leadership.
And
I remember-
to be clear, I don't know more about a person's experience than them. And so I know, but that's based on me and my experience. That has nothing to do, doesn't mean that's their truth. And I think it goes back to our past conversation about power dynamics. In a therapeutic setting, I do not want to be a person that says, hey, this is the way it's going to be. It's going to be my way or the highway. So buckle up or get out.
It sounds like you think if you interrupt someone, you're taking their autonomy away.
Yeah. Because I'm silencing them. So in a way, it does feel like taking away their autonomy.
They're choosing to, okay, how it was explained to me, I came to my supervisor when I'm working towards licensure, and I was told that means they're probably not connected to their emotions. They're filling in a lot of stuff, and we're not going deeper. And it serves them better to help redirect them to more feeling type of words, but they're not going to get any better. And so how I started to see it was, I'm going to do what they paid me for, which is to help them get more in touch with how they're feeling and get to the deeper things that are driving what's going on. And so if I let them keep talking, they're never going to get any better. And I haven't done them actually a service.
Mhm.
That's how I had to see it. It is really awkward and uncomfortable to disrupt what feels very comfortable for them.
Yeah, I think that's what I mean by when my therapist said something similar of like, people don't know how to show up and talk about these things sometimes, and they need help of having a really firm container to be held up against and say, let's do it like this, so that we can, because obviously what you've been doing isn't helping.
And I think it really does help people feel safer when they know the therapist is in control of the session. Like,
Yeah.
we've talked about how therapists who don't keep time, like, it actually can feel really activating. Like, you need to know your therapist is going to end on time.
Yeah. And it's like a part of me sees it and understands, and a part of me doesn't. There's still definitely an area for me to do some work in, because this is really connected to my story. And so it's hard for me to see outside of my story, to see the perspective that a part of me can see sometimes, but doesn't actually live out of that space.
And then the other part was the idea that of the messaging of the interruption, like that what you had societally received and then received in the family of not interrupting is a bit of a secret and has a cost with it for you to interrupt.
Yeah, and I think part of it, I'm thinking now as we're talking about this, part of it is like my own fear of embracing my own power. right? Because I'm so afraid of power and how power can harm, I just don't want to be powerful. I don't want to acknowledge or accept that I do have that in some scenarios, or I have really scary to say I am actually a person who is in a position of power and I'm responsible for how I hold that power.
What
Not
else
on
can power do?
It can help. It can advocate, right? It can support. It can probably do a lot of other things. I think I spend so much more time though thinking about how it can be harmful than how it can be helpful. And I think that's common. I don't want to speak for all women, but as women, we're not socialized to feel comfortable with our power.
No, but I'm just observing your TikTok video got more views than we've ever had before. So what good could come if your power were unleashed? Like, we're
Yeah,
missing out.
terrifies me.
In much the same way, Kristen, I would love for you to adopt that same philosophy. You actually have the product that people need. That product is Kristen inserting herself more frequently.
I think it's interesting because I've also been recently, for the first time in my life, OCD. A lot of my OCD comes around harm OCD. Like I'm really afraid of harming others, mostly not physically so much, but emotionally. And so I can see how even some of that is playing into this. Like a lot of times with OCD, somebody has like a feared version of their self. They're afraid that this is the person that they actually are. And the OCD kind of comes in and says, here's all of the things that could happen to prove that you are this actual terrible version of yourself. In reality, that feared version is generally the opposite of who you actually are. And so wrestling with that of that part of me that kind of creeps up of Kristen, you're a person who causes harm. And here's all the ways that harm could happen. And so it makes me really fearful of being heard or being seen or any of those things because there's so much potential. Oh, if you're in front of 800 people, surely I'm going to hurt one of them. Like this is the odds of I'm going to say something bad or I'm going to say something offensive or I'm going to do something wrong and then I'm a bad person. So it's interesting to see how, for me, I'm connecting some of that difficulty with under this OCD lens as well.
That phrase you used, Kristen, you're going to hurt someone. Who told you that? How old are you?
Nothing really explicit comes to my mind, which makes me think it's probably pretty young and or pretty pervasive of not something, again, not something explicit, but just a general feeling of, I don't know, maybe. I don't know. That's a really good question.
Let us know if you ever have a story with it.
Yeah, I will. Oh, what was being activated for you?
When she started to answer Dennis's first question and she was like going on, I'm trying to read everybody's faces. So I see both of you looking bored. And so now that's in the back of my mind. And then Dennis starts like cutting in. I'm like, oh, thank God. He feels comfortable doing that. Good for him. And he kept doing it. And then I started to feel like, oh man, am I putting this all on him to always be the interrupter? I better get in there and help out. And then I see you almost interrupted. And okay, now it's my job to make sure she gets to interrupt. And so I'm reading everybody's faces and trying to facilitate what I think is going to be, I guess, keep the peace for the people that I care about. That's just something that I do all the time. I think is read the face, figure out what they're gonna want, and make my move that way.
So how did that impact you?
To notice that you
Notice
guys
that.
could be bored or that Dennis was doing too much work. I just stay in that hypervigilant state all the time. It doesn't really feel any different from the baseline to always be vigilant and try to maintain, I don't know, calm waters. Yeah, because that same tendency, it's like codependent in other relationships. And yeah, that doesn't go very well.
Mm.
So really feeling the sting this past week of what happens when I can't just let people work through their own stuff and I dive in there and fix it for them or try to fix it for them and I am not able to do that. So yeah, a little frustration with that part. And also, I guess, just there was some surprise and confusion because we never had a podcast go quite like that before. Just want to throw it out and not use it.
Yeah, I don't think that I was expecting that to be the dynamic. And it felt just so frustrating because it was such a great story. There was so much I really wanted to engage in that story, and we couldn't get there.
Yeah, and she had good stories, but we couldn't get her to slow down, right? So it just felt like it must be coming from a place of trauma.
Mm.
And we don't have time for this. Like, how long was she thinking we were going to go? Like, what is she hoping to get out of this? I don't know. Yeah. So I guess I was just noticing my own better take care of everybody thing going on.
Is that you're reporting in now is a normal role that you have? Have you felt that way on the podcast in the past? Are you watching me and making sure that I appreciate your care? I want you to know I appreciate your care. You're
You don't need
amazing
it.
at it.
You're actually fine, right? What is my problem? Yeah.
I'll figure this out.
That's what I mean. Like with the frustrations, like they were actually just fine. Yeah.
I don't know how you even noticed that, like, Kristin was about to, like, the stuff that you notice, Elle, I'm like, holy shit, how do you notice all this stuff?
I feel like
You
every
noticed
time I
that I
almost
turned on
open
my
my every time I almost open my mouth, I see Elle's eyes.
Yeah, I didn't really realize that until this past year. Somebody named that I'm watching everybody's faces. I'm like, oh, holy cow. Yeah, that's true. I don't miss a lot.
And it's interesting because the fact that when you interrupted for the first time, I did feel relief because I was also feeling the tension that like, oh man, Dennis is doing all of this work and I'm frozen. Like I can't, like I'm having a response where I'm not able to show up and help in the way that I want to. And so I would have been fine if you wouldn't have said anything. I would have felt more distressed, but like it was relief. And like when you see my face, it is nice. It does feel good to be seen. And it's not needed. And what would have been different if you had not chosen to engage in that way? Like, how would the podcast have been different? Hard to know, but it's like kind of that, but it is a bind, like, right? Where there is goodness in what you offer. And it's at a really big cost to you to offer that
Yeah.
all the time when it's not always needed.
Thank you. I hadn't thought about it like that. And I might have to think about that a little bit more. Also,
Yeah,
I
I
should
like
be
it.
honest. It's my own intolerance to boredom. I just didn't want to I didn't want to have a boring podcast.
I'm envisioning is there a way, sometimes you can just cook up some popcorn, have some popcorn sitting there and just relax and throw the popcorn in. But I'm with Kristin. I do a benefit. I just like benefit.
That's how systems work,
Totally.
right? Like even somebody's dysfunctional, not in a kind way, like dysfunctional habits, like it benefits the system. And that's why people get stuck in the patterns that they do because people are like, oh, I like the thing that you do that helps me but harms you.
And that's where we end today. We are so glad you joined us. We want to invite you to get involved in the show. First, be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. That way, you don't miss out on a future episode. If you're super curious, you can also find us on YouTube. Second, if you'd like to learn more about joining us and sharing your story, send us an email at phoenixeffectpodcast@gmail.com. That's phoenixeffectpodcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. This podcast and website represents the opinions of Elizabeth Key, Kristin Boskel-John, and Dennis Roberts, and their guests to the show and website. The content here should not be taken as medical or psychological advice. This content is for informational purposes only, and because each person is so unique, please consult your healthcare professional for any medical questions. The views and opinions expressed in the podcast and website are our own and do not represent that of our places of work. While we make every effort to ensure that the information we are sharing is accurate, we welcome any comments, suggestions, or correction of errors. No guarantee is given regarding the accuracy of any statements or opinions made on the podcast or website. In no way does listening, reading, emailing, or interacting on social media with our content establish a therapist-client relationship.